Okay, this is going to be a lecture synopsis for unit number 1 in the guitar theory, theory for guitar textbook. At any rate, I'm going to be talking about musical notation, since this is what we're going to be using throughout the semester. And I'll start at the very beginning. And I do understand that some of you may have already received some type of musical training where this is just a repeat of things you've heard. But of course, since the course requires no prerequisite, I'm going to start as if students have never had any of this information given to them. At any rate, the 5 lines that we're going to be using in musical notation that you'll see here is known as a staff. And on this staff, the representation of musical letter names using the alphabet from A through G only are going to be represented on either a line or a space in this 5-line staff. One of the things that determines where those letters are going to be or what they are is what's called a clef sign. This is a treble clef. This is what we use when we're reading guitar music. That's been the tradition of guitar notation reading, is to use a treble clef. And there are many clefs. There's bass clef, there's tenor clef. This is the only clef that we will use. And so this tenor clef here, with this scroll around this section here, sometimes is known also as a G clef. And that scroll basically surrounds the line that represents the letter G. And so you can see that the scroll goes right to that line. And that's what will be a G note. At that point, all the letters will then go consecutively as they would in the alphabet, with lines and spaces. So if G is represented by this line here, as you ascend, you will go to the next letter in the alphabet. Of course, we finish at G, so the next letter up actually starts the whole alphabet again, A. And then the next line would be B, next space is C, next line is D, next space is E, and the final top line is F. If you go backwards, it's the alphabet backwards. So from the G line to the next space below is F, and the next line below is E. Now, many instructors, when teaching the treble clef and memorization of where the letters are located, often use this as a way to remember what the lines and spaces of the treble clef represent. First line, E, they use the word every. Second line, G, good. Third line, B, boy. Fourth line, D, does. And then final line, F, fine. Every good boy does fine. In the UK, I think they say every good boy deserves favor. Actually, that was a Moody Blues album name from the 60s, late 60s. Then the next part is to get the spaces. And a great way to memorize that is that it spells the word face, F-A-C and E. So you'll want to thoroughly memorize the positions of the lines and spaces of the treble clef. And then, because the range of the guitar is so large, we do go outside of the clef, or outside of the 5 lines, rather. A piano will use what's called a grand staff, and they'll have a treble clef and then another clef called a bass clef underneath it, and use both staves or staffs at the same time. And the only thing that will be in between them will be one little line which represents the note C. But in the absence of a bass clef, we have to add additional lines to the treble clef staff. Those are called ledger lines. It can be spelled without the D as well. I've seen that many times. Either way, the addition of extra lines to a staff is called ledger lines. The same principle applies. As you're moving up or down, you still go consecutively up or down the musical alphabet. So F was the top line of the treble clef staff. If we were to go to the just above that, that would be considered like a space. That would be G. And then if we were to hit the next, on the first ledger line above the treble clef, that would actually be an A. And then if we went in between, as you can see here, that's what this note is, that would be a B. And then if we went further up to another ledger line up, that would be a C. You don't have to memorize those as much at this point in the semester because we'll be covering those notes a little later. The lower notes we will cover actually fairly quickly. So the notes as you descend, we have the lowest line represented by the letter E. So if we were to go below that, that would actually be a D. And then the first ledger line below the treble clef will then be C. If I went below that, it would be B, and of course, 2 below ends up being A. And of course, we'll go all the way down. This note that I have here is the lowest note that the guitar reads when we're tuned in standard tuning. Guitar can be tuned in a variety of ways, but in standard tuning, E is the lowest note. 3 ledger lines and a half down. So ledger lines are going to be definitely things that you're going to be familiarize yourself with in the notation of guitar music because we use so many. Now on the next page, I'll set that up. The next page represents how we deal with rhythm and the notation of it. And of course, you know, rhythm deals with time, duration of time, and that's the very ingenious part about how music has been developed because we have symbols to represent a length of time, a temporal type of representation, which is really very, very interesting. So what I mentioned in the lecture in class is that I started off with the symbol called a whole note, and it's represented by just a oval without anything attached to it. I also, in the textbook, put the equivalent rests. A rest is something that will represent silence in music because we do also need that notated when we don't want you to play something during amount of space and time. So with this whole note, I have mentioned that, that the beats that are represented with this whole note is going to be 4 beats, and I did explain that in a time signature, which I will in a moment. So let's say that when we count 1, 2, 3, 4, the total of all those counts that I just did would be represented by this note, the whole note. If I cut that in half, it will look like this, the oval-shaped note with a stem. And it would take 2 of these to equal the same amount of sound, duration of sound as the whole note. And you can see that the whole note, or the half note rather, rest looks a little bit different. It looks like a hat. That's sometimes how I kind of tell people that if they want to remember half, think of the H and it looks like a little hat. That would take 2 beats. So it's 1, 2, and then the next half note, 3, 4, if I were to include it next to each other. The quarter note looks like this. It's a filled-in note with a stem called a quarter note, and it would take only 1 count for a quarter note. So it takes 4 quarter notes to equal the time duration of a whole note. The quarter note rest looks pretty interesting. That's the look of a quarter note rest. And as you can see, it only takes 1 beat or 1 count to equal this. Eighth note. If we were to, again, divide that in half, an eighth note looks like the quarter note, but it has a flag on it. We call that a flag. It would take 8 of these to equal 1 whole note. It's actually equal to half a beat. And the rest looks like this. So if we were counting, this would be 1, 2, 3, 4. Half note would be 1, 2, and then 3, 4 for a second half note, because I'm trying to do equivalent to whole notes. This would be 1, 2, 3, 4. And then if we're going to do eighth notes, you actually have to have it divided, subdivided we call it. So that I'm not going to only go 1, 2, 3, 4, but in between I'm going to say an and that also represents an eighth note. So it would be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And each time I counted 1, 2, 3, 4 would represent a quarter note, and the ands are included. So in between each beat or count is an and so therefore I can talk to musicians and say, I want you to accent the and of 2. Therefore you would be going 1 and 2 and that would be the accent, and it would be a specific spot in the music. So those are the notes, that values that we're going to use initially. Whole notes, halves, quarters, and eighth notes. In fact, in the first lesson that you're going to see, we're only going to be using quarter notes and I believe maybe a whole note. This is what the breakdown looks like if you were to see a kind of a pictogram of the equivalencies of each of these durations of the notes. Now, what I did want to mention is that how do we know that there's 4 beats for this whole note? One of the things that I don't have on this particular page here, which I will represent on the next page, is what's called a time signature. Now, this right here, here's your treble clef. This right here, this thing that looks like a C, is called common time. Oftentimes, you will see that also as 4, 4, 4. It will look like a fraction, a 4 on top and then a 4 below. It's interesting because they call it common, but it's common knowledge in music that if you see a C, that it does represent 4 and 4. Top number 4 represents how many counts in a measure, and a measure is this space that you see between these, what we call bar lines. So this space is a measure divided by bar lines. If it says common time or 4/4, you can only put the equivalent of 4 quarter notes per measure. So I could put 1 whole note there, 2 half notes, but no more than that. Then you have to go on to the next measure. So that's what tells me how long the duration of each of those notes happen to be. So when we get on this page here, on page 8, we do start working on the guitar, on the instrument, and you'll see here that when we play, or rather look at this note here, this is an E in the treble clef, of course, and then this is a B in the treble clef, and this is a G in the treble clef. This represents on your guitar these strings. The first string, E, which is actually the highest string, the one that's furthest away from you. I'll also play a little bit of this on an instrument. And then the B is the second string from the lowest set of strings, or from the strings furthest away from you, and then the G. So anytime I see these particular symbols here is when I would play those particular strings. So for example, this E is played 4 times. That's 4 times on the first string. Here's B, 4 times on the second string. G, 4 times on the third string. And anything that the notation tells me to do, then I will just follow the directions. So next I'm just going to kind of talk about, on the instrument, the different techniques that you can use, because I do like to show you technique in the class. I'll do a classical technique in which I'm using my right hand fingers, if you're right-handed, or left-hand fingers, but an alternation of the notes. And also if you're going to use a pick, and I don't mind if you do either in this class, alternate picking, where you would do a downstroke and an upstroke for each individual note. So that will be the part where I have the guitar in hand. Okay, what I'm going to demonstrate is just some of the techniques that you can use when you're playing these open strings. And as I had mentioned to you, when I say the first string, a lot of people, if they've not had the experience with the instrument and what the strings are called, would think of the one that's closest to them as the first. But actually, it's the one that's the furthest away. So first string actually is the top, is the one that's the furthest away. And I actually say top because the pitch is higher. So this would be E, second string is B, third string is G, fourth string is D, fifth string is A, sixth string is E. And those are all notated in the textbook. So what I was talking about as far as technique is if you want to play and use classical guitar technique, you would use the fingers of your right hand if you're right-handed and alternate for each note. So the first measure of our exercise has 4 quarter notes and they're all high E's on the first string. So you would actually go index finger, middle finger, index finger, middle finger for those 4 notes, as opposed to just doing like this. Now some people like to use their thumb, and they can. And it's okay if you use your thumb if you're comfortable with that, but if you want to try to get a little bit more technique and get familiar with classical, then it's always alternate. You always alternate notes. So first measure would be 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the second measure would be 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if you use a pick, I advocate that you use when you're first starting, it's okay to just use what are called downstroke. So you could just use a downstroke for each note. But if you want to get better technically, it's better to do what's called alternate picking, alternating. So that you'd go down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. That's better technique, especially if you want to go quicker. Same thing would be if you want to go quicker with the classical. You would alternate, and that's the reason for it, is the alternation provides better speed and ultimately accuracy. So you may want to try all those techniques if you've initially started playing the notation and the notated notes that are just open strings only in unit number 1. And that's it.